U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has warned Middle East leaders that the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant is a threat not only to Iraq but to the entire region. So what does this crisis mean for Iraq's neighbor Iran? Will the U.S. and Iran form an alliance to combat ISIL? To discuss this, I'm joined now by Raed Jarrar, a policy impact coordinator at the American Friends Service Committee, Reza Marashi, a research director at the National Iranian American Council, and Erik Gustafson, an executive director of the Education for Peace in Iraq Center. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for joining us. Right, let me start with you. You got Secretary of State Kerry there warning of a wider conflict in the Middle East. But just to add to the complications in Iraq, the Mahdi army, which we heard a lot about during the Iraq war, headed by Muqtada al-Sadr, has just been reactivated, and he says he's not going to subject his army to control by the Baghdad government. Are we going to see a bigger conflict here?
There is a bigger conflict on its way now. Unfortunately, Iraq's divisions that were more demographic have turned into a larger political and sectarian conflict. So it's been a conflict in the making, I think, in the last 11 years. And now we're just seeing the results of really bad decisions that we're taking in the last decade or so.
Reza, we now have a situation where the United States, it would seem, needs the help of Iran to defuse this crisis. Are we going to see an alliance now between Washington and Tehran?
No, I think it's fair to say that they need each other. Iran cannot operate independent of the United States anymore. This game of trying to hurt one's security in order to achieve your own has blown up in both of their faces. So I don't think it's a question of whether or not we'll see collaboration. It's a matter of what that collaboration looks like. Typically, when America collaborates with a Middle Eastern country, it's in plain sight for everybody to see. I think the kind of collaboration you're going to see between Iran and the United States is going to be covert. There's going to be a lot of communication. It's going to be done in a way primarily to make sure that they avoid fighting one another so that the nuclear issue doesn't blow up in tandem with these other issues as well. And it's going to be in an effort to try to feel one another out, because we have to remember that after essentially 3 decades of not talking to one another, there is going to be a getting to know you period to get a feel for how much flexibility both sides have.
Okay. Erik, we've had Secretary of State Kerry in Iraq. He's been holding talks in Baghdad, holding talks in Erbil. There's nothing concrete. He's come up with no concrete proposals besides calling for all sides to reconcile, get together, and resolve this situation. What are the United States' options right now?
Well, I think what's important right now is that the Obama administration is finally becoming more engaged on Iraq. For almost 2 years, President Obama, the White House, was silent about Iraq, and I think that was part of how we got into this crisis, that disengagement on the part of the U.S. So right now, I think the options are providing assistance to the Iraqi government to combat these militants, groups like ISIS, as well as some of the insurgent groups. But I think that what's really clear, and so far the president, I think, has sent the right signals, that it's not about siding with one side of a conflict and another in a civil war. And it's a recognition that Prime Minister Maliki has been a huge liability. In a lot of ways, the policies of the Prime Minister in Iraq has created an environment that has allowed militant groups to sweep across such a large part of the territory. So there's going to be a push for more of a national unity government in Baghdad, especially at this critical time because Iraq is going through the government formation process.
Right. Erik makes a great point that the United States has not been focused on Iraq for the last 2 years, which has led to this situation. The United States would say this is al-Maliki's fault. He caused this.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this time everyone is trying to blame the other side. I personally think the U.S. Is to blame for invading Iraq and not for leaving Iraq. I don't think the U.S. Withdrawal from Iraq caused what we are living now. I think the U.S. going into Iraq and destroying all of the infrastructure and the political process that was ongoing in the country is definitely something that we can trace all of the violence back to.
Did Nouri al-Maliki make a mistake by, well, literally abandoning the Sunni people in Iraq?
I mean, you know, Nouri al-Maliki is just a figure that represents the new Iraqi political system. This is an Iraqi political system that is based on sectarian divisions and sectarian quotas. Many people think that al-Maliki did a good job within the parameters that he was allowed to work within. So now, you know, the idea of changing him as a leader won't really make that much of a difference. It's not that if you bring another Shiite leader and replace al-Maliki, the crisis will be over, because the problems are way deeper than the person of the prime minister. The problems have to do with the entire concept of the political system in Iraq.
Right, yet he is under pressure from the United States to go. Not in so many words, that's not what the US is saying, but they would like to see him go. Reza, Nouri al-Maliki spent a great deal of his time in exile in Iran. He has a close relationship with Iran. Will Iran now be putting pressure on him?
I think so. We should remember, though, that even though Iran has a massive amount of leverage over Maliki, Maliki is a nationalist at heart, and no Iraqi nationalist wants to be seen as being pushed around by an Iranian master, and we should be clear about that. That being said, yes, Maliki is in power largely due to Iranian assistance, though not entirely. And I think that there is a bit of a strategy here going on that Maliki and the Iranians agree on, which is ISIS has made progress. And if they make a little bit more, that serves as an impetus for Shia and Kurd to sharpen the focus on their need to collaborate more effectively, right? And right now, the fabric of what's holding Iraq together is probably going to be predicated on security first. And then once security is established, reestablished, whichever word you prefer, then you can start to address some of the other underlying issues that were very eloquently outlined. But right now, the focus is on security, and I think it's bigger than Maliki, but Maliki has actually been empowered, at least in the short term. It's the medium to long term, and his ability to stop overreaching and manipulating the political system and sectarian differences that I think is going to make all the difference. And this is something the Iranians agree on as well.
Okay, Erik, we're hearing security first, but is each group in Iraq, the Sunnis, the Shias, and the Kurds, going to act in their own interest?
Well, I think any community that's under threat is always going to seek to act in its own interests. But there are definitely opportunities for greater collaboration. I think both of the guests, Reza and Raed, make very good points. The issues are deeper than just the personality of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. However, I think there are real challenges as long as he stays there. I don't think President Obama has called for him to step down, like he's called for Assad of Syria to step down. But it's clear that the U.S. no longer supports Maliki's continuation as the premiership. And there is hope that it will be somebody who is able to trust others and build a more of a coalition government.
Raed, you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like an interesting point that Erik raises regarding the U.S. position when it comes to the revolution and uprising in Syria versus the uprising in Iraq. The U.S. has a very confused relationship to these two countries, because in Syria, the U.S. has called for the resignation of the president. They have taken anti-regime stands and have been at least openly taking a pro-armed opposition stand. In Iraq, across the border, the U.S. is taking a pro-regime stand and an anti-armed opposition stand, which is really confusing because the two regimes are very strong allies, and the armed groups are actually allied to each other. So Iran's policy in the region makes more sense. From an Iranian perspective, Iran is supporting the Assad regime and the Iraqi regime in Baghdad. This makes a lot of sense geographically. Right. It adds up to other people in the region. For the U.S. policy is extremely confusing to people in Iraq and the region because it seems to be contradictory. They support opposite sides on opposite sides of the border.
Right. Reza, I want to ask you a question which I've asked our other guests as well, and that is the question of linkage between what Iran can do in Iraq and what Iran does with the United States insofar as the nuclear talks are concerned. Is Iran going to say, well, yes, we're prepared to help in Iraq, but, you've got to ease up the pressure on us as far as the nuclear talks are concerned?
That's a great question. I think both sides were in Vienna last week saying that exact thing to one another. The reality of the situation is both sides are trying to show a little bit of leg, as the old saying goes, to say, if you give more on this issue, the nuclear issue, this collaboration could continue in some way, shape, or form on over half a dozen issues that are critical to the national security of Iran and the United States, where there's been little to no collaboration. We're talking Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, you name it. At the end of the day, though, it's a matter of the price tag. And so far, the price tag of the United States has been too high for Iran, and vice versa. But this insistence on not collaborating with one another because of domestic political realities has become too costly. So there needs to be a sharpened focus and a realization on both sides that win-win outcomes, collective security, is the only pathway forward. Otherwise, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Okay, let me get Erik's take on that. Erik, the relationship between the United States and Iran, do you see some kind of linkage here?
I do. I think Reza is absolutely right. I think there has to be a fundamental shift how the United States approaches the entire region. You can't just look at one country and have a policy toward one country and ignore the rest of the region. You have to have a coordinated effort. And I think that in the case of Iraq, given the role that Iraq's neighbors have been playing within the conflict inside Iraq, there's a critical need to have a contact group and efforts to try to stem the flow of weapons and arms that fuel a lot of the violence. Absolutely, and it's a recognition that there can be a win-win solution for overall security for the entire region.
Okay. Right, was the United States caught totally unaware of what was going on in northern Iraq?
They might have. There isn't that much.
Because it seemed to be presented as a complete surprise.
You know, it was a surprise even for those who took part of the uprising, because the Iraqi army that has been trained and armed by the U.S. and the other Iraqi allies, and you know, a few tens of billions of dollars were spent to arm it, collapsed in 3 or 4 days. So 50% of Iraq's you know, area, the territory of Iraq, fell out of the control of the army in a week. It wasn't very expected, I think, by many. But at the same time, the fact that ISIL itself was not expecting this, because it wasn't the only leader of what's going on. They are one of the main players. I think the U.S. mainstream media, English-speaking media, have been exaggerating the size of ISIL.
And tends to group them all as one.
There are other groups, you know, like former Baathists, you know, members of the former
which was a
government.
point made by our previous guest. Reza, very quickly, if you could tell me, is Iraq going to remain a unitary state?
I think so, because the stakes of fragmenting it into 3 separate entities according to religious or ethnic lines is a recipe for disaster that's going to explode in everybody's face.
Okay, let me get Erik's take on this. And Erik, you're going to have the final word. Is Iraq going to remain a unitary state, or are we going to see, yes, one state, but with a large degree of autonomy for the different regions?
I think that it will hopefully stay as one single state. If anything, if any part of the country breaks away, it's possible for the North. But I think even the North has an interest in remaining as a part of a unified state of Iraq. So I disagree with the idea that the country is disintegrating. I think there's conflict and there's a lot of effort that has to be done to be able to restore peace.
Okay, Erik Gustafson, Raed Jarrar, Reza Marashi, thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.